Nobody moves. We got a tip this wedding is a front, Officer Blake Harrington said as the chapel doors opened and the music stopped in the middle of a violin note. For one suspended second, the whole garden venue seemed to forget how to breathe. White roses lined the aisle. Late Georgia sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, laying blue, gold, and crimson across the ivory runner. Guests who had been smiling only moments earlier turned toward the entrance, where uniformed officers filled the doorway beneath the wooden arch covered in magnolia leaves. Ava Monroe stood just behind the aisle curtain in her ivory wedding gown, one hand wrapped around a bouquet of white roses, the other resting lightly against her mother's arm. She was 41, black, calm by training and by choice, but the words still reached her like cold water poured over something sacred. At the altar, Ethan Cole turned toward her, his face shifting from joy to alarm, then to discipline as he lifted one hand gently toward the guests, asking them with his body to stay calm. Reverend Samuel Brooks stood frozen behind the open Bible, his silver hair catching the stained light. Ava's mother, Lillian, tightened her fingers around the lace handkerchief until the fabric folded into itself. Officer Harrington stepped farther inside, white, 44, rigid in posture, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed command could make any room belong to him. Everyone stay where you are. This is a public safety matter. The phrase sounded clean, but it moved through the chapel like dust over a wedding cake. Ava looked past the flowers, past the guests, past the sudden fear spreading across faces that had come to witness vows, and found the blinking body camera on Harrington's chest. She did not step forward quickly. She did not shout. She lifted her chin, held her bouquet steady, and said, "Officer, state the legal basis for interrupting this ceremony on camera." Several heads turned toward her. Harrington's eyes narrowed, as if the bride's calm had offended him more than panic would have. "Ma'am, stay back and let us secure the room." Ava took one careful step into the aisle, the hem of her gown brushing the runner. "Is there a warrant?" Harrington glanced toward the officers behind him. "We received an anonymous complaint." "That is not a warrant," Ava said. Officer Paige Miller, younger, white, 31, standing near the entrance, looked down at her radio as if suddenly hearing the weakness in the word anonymous. Harrington stiffened. "We have a tip about possible organized illegal activity at this location." A murmur moved through the guests, then died when Ethan spoke softly from the altar. "Everyone breathe. Do not argue. Let the record show what is happening." Harrington pointed toward him. "Sir, step aside." Ava's grip tightened around the bouquet just enough for one petal to tremble. She saw her mother's handkerchief slip from Lillian's fingers onto the front pew. She saw the ring pillow near Reverend Brooks, the two gold bands waiting in a square of sunlight, untouched by the suspicion now filling the room. "Officer Harrington," Ava said, reading his nameplate. "Activate and preserve all body cameras, preserve the dispatch audio, identify the caller information through proper procedure, confirm warrant status, and request a supervisor before you continue disrupting a lawful private event." The chapel went silent again, but this silence was different. It was not fear alone. It was recognition that the bride knew exactly what power was supposed to sound like when it entered a room honestly. Harrington gave a short, humorless breath. "Stop performing legal knowledge and let us do our job." Ava looked at him through the stained glass light, her voice low enough to steady the guests and clear enough for every camera. "The law is not a performance when power interrupts innocent people." Outside, a patrol radio crackled near the doorway. Inside, the violinist lowered her bow completely. Harrington looked around the room, seeing flowers, family, black joy, a groom in a tailored suit, a mother holding back tears, and a bride who refused to shrink. "Separate the groom," he ordered. Ethan did not resist. He only looked at Ava, and in that look was a promise stronger than panic. Ava stood in the aisle with white roses in her hands, not yet revealed as a federal judge, not yet protected by any title the officers would respect, but already guarding the one thing they had underestimated, the record of the truth. Ava Monroe had spent most of her life learning how to remain still while rooms misunderstood her. Long before she stood in an ivory wedding gown with white roses trembling in her hands, she had been the young black law student in the back row who was spoken over until her answers became impossible to ignore. She had been the public defender who stayed late with case files while courthouse lights buzzed above empty hallways. She had been the federal prosecutor who learned that truth needed patience, not performance. And eventually she had become a federal judge, a woman trusted to weigh liberty, evidence, procedure, and the human cost of power misused. But on this day, she had not come to the historic garden venue as anyone's judge. She had come as a bride. She had chosen the chapel because her father once brought her there as a child to hear a community choir, because the stained glass windows caught late afternoon light in colors that made even silence feel blessed, because her mother said the old wooden pews carry prayers from people who had loved through worse days and still believed in joy. Ava wanted 1 hour where no one called her Your Honor, where no one waited for rulings, where no one rose when she entered except the man who loved her. Ethan Cole stood near the altar now, separated by an officer's gesture but not by fear, his dark suit still perfect, his face controlled with the discipline of a civil rights attorney who understood that panic could give power an excuse. Reverend Samuel Brooks kept one hand on the open Bible, his eyes moving from Ava to the officers to the guests, silently asking the room to hold its dignity. Lillian Monroe sat in the front pew with her lace handkerchief fallen beside her shoe, staring at her daughter with the pain of a mother watching happiness interrupted by suspicion. Ava saw all of it, the violinist's bow lowered at her side, the flower girl frozen near the aisle runner, the ring bearer clutching the velvet pillow, the gold bands waiting in a square of stained light. She also saw Officer Paige Miller near the entrance, reading something on her radio screen with a crease between her brows. That crease mattered. Doubt was sometimes the first honest witness. Officer Harrington moved down the aisle as if every petal and pew had become evidence because he said so. "Bride, stay where you are," he ordered. Ava looked at the body camera again. "My name is Ava Monroe. This is a private wedding ceremony at a reserved venue. The contract is with the venue office. The guest list is at the entrance table. The officiant, coordinator, and venue manager can confirm all of it." Harrington gave her a hard look. "That will be reviewed after the room is secured." "Secured based on what specific allegation?" she asked. "Anonymous complaint. Anonymous complaints still require evaluation before intrusion. You do not decide that." Ava's voice remained low, almost gentle, because her guests needed steadiness more than volume. "No. The Constitution does." A soft breath passed through the pews, not applause, not defiance, just the sound of people hearing law spoken in a place where fear had tried to take over. Harrington's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I am warning you." Ava shifted the bouquet from one hand to the other, careful not to drop a single rose. "And I am asking you to preserve the record before your warning becomes the only thing you remember accurately." Officer Miller looked up then. Ethan's eyes stayed on Ava. Lillian bent slowly and picked up the fallen handkerchief, pressing it to her chest. Outside, through the open chapel doors, Georgia heat shimmered over the stone walkway where patrol cars waited with silent lights. Inside, Ava stood before the aisle she had dreamed of walking, not in a robe, not on a bench, not behind any title, but with the same calm that had carried her through every courtroom where power had to be reminded of its limits. Officer Blake Harrington had built his career around the belief that control was the same thing as judgment. He liked rooms that went quiet when he entered, people who stepped back before he explained why, and reports that made hesitation look like danger after the fact. At 44, he had become a tactical response supervisor not because he understood every room, but because he could make every room respond to his voice. The historic garden venue did not look like the scenes he preferred. It smelled of white roses, polished wood, candle wax, and perfume. Stained glass light moved across the aisle in soft colors. Children sat beside grandparents. A violin rested against the shoulder of a musician who had lowered her bow. The groom stood near the altar in a dark suit, contained but watchful. The bride stood halfway down the aisle in ivory, holding flowers like she was holding the last unbroken piece of the ceremony. To Harrington, none of that slowed the suspicion he had brought with him. The anonymous tip had come in less than 20 minutes earlier, vague but sharp enough to fit what he expected to find: a large black gathering at a private venue, expensive cars in the lot, music, people moving in and out, something the caller described as not legitimate. He did not ask why the caller could not give names. He did not ask what crime had actually been observed. He did not ask whether a wedding at a reserved venue with a guest list, coordinator, officiant, and invitation table deserved to be treated as anything other than what it plainly was. He heard disorder because bias had already taught him which voices sounded believable. Now he stood in the aisle with officers behind him and called at public safety. Ava Monroe watched him read the room incorrectly and felt the old courtroom ache rise under her ribs, the one she felt whenever power entered first and facts were invited later. Officer Paige Miller moved toward the welcome table near the entrance, where ivory place cards, a printed guest list, and a framed sign reading Ceremony of Ava Monroe and Ethan Coles sat beside a bowl of white petals. She looked at the list, then at the radio transcript on her screen, then at Harrington. "Supervisor," she said carefully, "the call details are limited. No named suspect, no specific criminal act, no weapon allegation, no active threat." Harrington's head turned slowly. "Secure the room first." Ava's eyes stayed on his body camera. "Please record that your own officer has identified the tip as lacking specific details." A few guests inhaled. Harrington stepped closer, not enough to touch her, but enough to make the aisle feel narrower. "Ma'am, you are interfering." "No," Ava said. "I am distinguishing procedure from assumption." Ethan took one controlled step, but an officer raised a hand to keep him back. Reverend Brooks spoke then, voice low and grave. "Officer, this is a house of vows today. Treat it with care." Harrington did not look at him. Everyone will stay calm if everyone complies. Ava glanced at her mother, then at the velvet pillow where the wedding rings waited under stained light. "Compliance is not the same as consent to unlawful intrusion," she said. Harrington gave a thin smile, the kind men use when they mistake restraint for weakness. "You sure have a lot to say for a bride." The words moved through the chapel like a stain. Lillian's hand rose to her mouth. Officer Miller looked down at the guest list again, shame beginning to show at the edge of her face. Ava felt the bouquet stems press into her palm. She could have ended the room right then with one identification card. She could have let the title federal judge hit the aisle like a gavel. But if she did that too early, Harrington would remember only the title, not the wrongness of what he had done before knowing it. So she stood in the colored light, held her flowers steady, and answered with the quiet force that had sentenced lies, protected rights, and outlasted louder men. "And you have a lot of power for someone who has not yet stated a lawful basis." Ava Monroe's words did not make Officer Harrington louder right away. They made him pause, and the pause exposed more than anger would have. In the narrow aisle between the rows of white roses, he stood with his shoulders squared, body camera blinking, radio quiet at his shoulder, and nothing specific enough to answer the bride's question. The room felt it. Guests who had been holding their breath began looking from him to Officer Miller, from the welcome table to the open chapel doors, from the silent violin to the ring pillow still waiting in Reverend Brooks's hands. Officer Miller lifted the printed guest list and spoke with careful restraint. "Supervisor, the venue contract matches the ceremony. The coordinator confirmed the reservation. The invitation table is complete. The call transcript still does not list a specific crime." Harrington's jaw tightened. "We are not debating this in front of guests." Ava kept her bouquet steady. "Then request a supervisor and preserve the debate you are already creating." Ethan stood a few feet from the altar, still separated from her, his hands open at his sides. He had spent years as a civil rights attorney teaching frightened clients that dignity could survive a bad room if someone protected the facts. Now the bad room was his own wedding, and the woman he loved was standing inside it with flowers in her hands while officers treated her joy like a threat. "Officer," Ethan said calmly, "we are asking for verification, not confrontation." Harrington turned toward him. "Sir, remain where you are." Ava saw the edge in Harrington's voice and moved her attention back to the camera before the room could tighten around Ethan. Record that my groom has requested verification peacefully. Harrington looked at her with open irritation. You do not get to narrate my scene. This is not your scene, Ava said. It is our ceremony. The sentence moved through the pews like a hand placed gently on a wound. Lillian Monroe pressed her handkerchief to her chest, trying not to cry. A little girl in a pale dress leaned against her grandmother, confused by why adults with flowers and music had suddenly become so still. Reverend Brooks lowered the ring pillow to the altar rail, careful and slow, as though protecting the rings from the shame entering the room. Outside, Georgia heat shimmered beyond the chapel doors, and silent patrol lights colored the stone walkway in faint blue and red. Harrington spoke into his radio, requesting unit confirmation on complaint source and supervisor response. Officer Miller looked relieved that the words had finally been said, even if they came late. Ava nodded once, not as approval, but as record. Harrington noticed. Do not look so satisfied. Ava's face remained composed. Satisfaction is not what you are seeing. Then what is it? Patience. The answer struck him harder than defiance. Harrington glanced toward the guests, perhaps realizing that the room was no longer simply obeying him. They were watching him become accountable in real time. His authority had entered like a storm, but Ava's calm was making every drop visible. Bride, he said, deliberately avoiding her name. Step to the side while we complete the check. Ava looked at the aisle beneath her feet, the ivory runner her mother had helped choose, the rose petals scattered by children who had been smiling minutes earlier. I will stand where I am unless you state a lawful reason to move me. Officer Miller shifted. Supervisor, if there is no active threat and no warrant, we should avoid further disruption until the chief arrives. Harrington turned on her. I gave an order. Miller did not step back. Her voice was quiet, but it stayed alive. Yes, sir. I am documenting the concern. Ava finally looked at her, and something passed between them, not friendship, not forgiveness, but recognition that truth sometimes begins as one person refusing to edit what they see. Harrington's radio crackled before he could answer. Dispatch came through with a clipped voice. Complaint caller refused name. Reported suspicious gathering, loud music, expensive vehicles, possible illegal activity. No specific suspect. No direct observation of crime. Chief Ross en route. The chapel absorbed the words in stunned silence. Harrington's face hardened as if the truth had insulted him. Ava closed her eyes for one breath, feeling the stems of the white roses against her palm and the ache of the aisle under her feet. When she opened them, her voice was softer, but not weaker. Then preserve that dispatch audio, she said. Because what you just heard is the difference between public safety and prejudice wearing a uniform. The dispatch call did not end the disruption, but it changed the air inside the chapel. A vague complaint had entered through a phone line and become uniforms in a wedding aisle, but now the words were public. No named suspect, no specific crime, no direct observation, no active threat. Guests sat frozen beneath the stained glass light, their faces carrying the same question in different forms. How had Joy become suspicious so quickly? Officer Harrington stood in the center aisle with the authority he had brought and still on his shoulders, but it no longer fit him cleanly. Officer Miller kept her notebook open near the welcome table, writing down the dispatch response before anyone could soften it later. Ava Monroe stood where she had been told to move from, her ivory gown touching the aisle runner, the bouquet of white roses firm in her hands, her breathing slow enough to steady the room even while her own heart ached. Ethan remained separated near the altar, close enough for Ava to see the restraint in his face and far enough for the separation to feel deliberate. Reverend Brooks rested one hand on the ring pillow, the gold band still waiting in the light. Lillian Monroe dabbed at her eyes with the lace handkerchief, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet grief of a mother watching her daughter's wedding become a test of dignity. Harrington spoke again, louder than necessary. Until the chief arrives, no one leaves and no one resumes the ceremony. Ava looked at his camera. Record that the ceremony remains suspended despite dispatch confirming no specific suspect, no specific crime, and no direct observation of criminal activity. Harrington's eyes flashed. You are not in charge here. Ava's voice stayed low. Neither is an anonymous caller. A murmur moved through the pews before Reverend Brooks lifted his hand, and the room settled again. Officer Miller stepped closer to Harrington and said quietly, Supervisor, we should limit further intrusion. The caller details are not supporting the level of response. Harrington turned his head toward her. You are letting her talk you out of doing your job. Miller's face tightened, but she did not look away. I am documenting why we are here. Harrington looked back at Ava. Bride, you are going to stop performing legal knowledge. Ava felt the words strike the room. Bride, not her name. Performing, not protecting. Legal knowledge, as if law became suspicious when it came from a black woman in an ivory gown. She looked at the ring pillow, at the roses, at the guests who had dressed for a covenant and been forced into stillness by fear someone else had phoned in. Then she answered, clear and gentle. The law is not a performance when power interrupts innocent people. Ethan closed his eyes for half a breath, then opened them, pride and pain moving across his face. Harrington's jaw clenched. Move the groom farther from the altar. An officer gestured for Ethan to take another step aside. Ethan complied slowly, palms visible, never taking his eyes from Ava. That small movement hurt more than Ava expected. The aisle between them had been designed for her walk toward him. Now it held officers, questions, and the weight of being treated like a threat on the day she had chosen joy. For a moment, the chapel seemed to narrow until only objects remained. White roses trembling slightly from her grip, the velvet pillow at the altar, the fallen petal near her shoe, the violin bow resting silent against the musician's skirt, her mother's handkerchief pressed to trembling lips, the stained glass color lying across the floor like fractured sunlight. Ava remembered her father standing outside a courthouse years ago, his hands rough from work, his voice soft because he never needed volume to be believed by her. Justice is what you protect when your heart is hurting. She held those words now, not as comfort, but as instruction. Outside, another vehicle turned onto the venue driveway. Through the open chapel doors, tires rolled over gravel, slow and official. Officer Miller glanced toward the entrance. Chief Ross is here, she said. Harrington straightened, trying to recover the shape of command before his supervisor walked in. Ava did not move. She lifted her bouquet slightly, not as a shield, but as a reminder of what the room had been before suspicion entered it. When Chief Daniel Ross stepped through the chapel doors, white, 55, composed, taking in the frozen guests, the separated groom, the crying mother, the silent music, and the bride standing in the aisle under stained light, his face changed before anyone spoke. He looked at Harrington first. Then he looked at Ava. Who authorized the interruption of this ceremony? He asked. Ava turned her eyes to the body camera and spoke before the answer could be reshaped. That is exactly what I have been asking them to document. Chief Daniel Ross did not step farther into the chapel until the silence had answered him. He stood beneath the open doors with the late Georgia heat behind him and the stained glass light ahead, his eyes moving carefully from the officers in the aisle to the guests in the pews, from Ethan Cole standing away from the altar to Lillian Monroe clutching her handkerchief in the front row, from the silent violinist to the ring pillow resting under Reverend Brooks's hand. Last, his gaze settled on Ava Monroe, a black bride in an ivory gown holding white roses with the steadiness of someone refusing to let humiliation become the loudest thing in the room. Harrington straightened. Chief, we responded to an anonymous complaint regarding possible organized illegal activity at this venue. Ross looked at Officer Miller. What specific criminal act was reported? Miller answered before Harrington could reshape it. None specified, sir. Dispatch confirmed no named suspect, no direct observation of a crime, no active threat, and the caller refused identification. Ross's face tightened by one measured degree. Ava watched him absorb the record. That mattered to her more than outrage. Outrage could be useful, but accuracy could survive paperwork. Was there a warrant? Ross asked. Harrington's jaw moved. No, Chief. We entered under public safety concern. Ava looked directly at Ross's body camera, which had just begun recording as he arrived. I requested warrant status, legal basis, dispatch preservation, caller documentation, body camera preservation, venue camera preservation, supervisor review, and a halt to further disruption until the basis was clarified. Miller lifted her notebook. Confirmed. Harrington turned toward her, but Ross raised one hand, not dramatic, just enough to stop the old chain of command from burying the truth. Let her finish. Ava felt the room exhale quietly around her. She lowered the bouquet slightly, and one loose rose petal slipped onto the aisle runner near her shoe. The small white shape on the ivory fabric almost hurt more than the radios and uniforms. She remembered her father's voice again, not from a courtroom but from their kitchen table when she was 17 and furious over a teacher who had mistaken her confidence for disrespect. Justice is what you protect when your heart is hurting. Ava held the sentence steady inside her. This is a private wedding ceremony, she said. There is a venue contract, a guest list, a coordinator, an officiant, and witnesses. My groom was separated. My guests were instructed not to move. My mother has been sitting in the front pew crying while officers act on a complaint that, by dispatch's own words, contains no specific allegation. Ross looked toward Lillian, and something in his face softened before his command returned. Officer Harrington, suspend the operation pending review. Harrington's posture stiffened. Chief, with respect, we still need to secure the location. Ross's voice lowered. You have not articulated a basis to continue. Ethan took a slow breath at the altar. Reverend Brooks closed his eyes briefly, as if giving thanks for one sentence of order returning to a room of vows. Ava reached carefully into the small satin pocket hidden in the seam of her gown. She moved slowly, making sure every officer could see her hands. From it, she removed a slim identification case. She did not open it for the guests first. She turned to Chief Ross, stepped only as far as the aisle allowed, and presented it with the same procedural calm she had asked of them. Ross took the case, opened it, and read the credentials. Federal Judiciary Identification. Judge Ava Monroe. United States District Court. The words changed nothing about her rights, but they changed everything about the assumptions in the room. Ross looked up from the identification, then at Harrington. His voice carried to every pew. You interrupted the wedding of a federal judge on an unverified complaint. The chapel became so quiet that the air conditioning could be heard above the open doors. Harrington's face lost its color. Miller looked down at her notes, then back at Ava with a mixture of shame and respect. Ava accepted the identification back and closed the case without flourish. She did not smile. She did not let the title do what the truth should have already done. Chief, she said softly, please make sure the record reflects that my title was discovered after the legal basis had already failed. Ross nodded once. It will. And in that moment, the room understood that the robe had never been the source of her authority. It had only been the part power recognized too late. Chief Ross's promise did not repair the ceremony, but it gave the room something solid to stand on. Ava Monroe held her judicial identification case closed in one hand and her bouquet in the other, the white roses still intact except for the single petal lying near the hem of her gown. Officer Harrington stood in the aisle with his authority stripped down to the facts he had failed to gather. The body cameras were still blinking. Officer Miller's notebook was open. Dispatch had already confirmed the caller refused a name and gave no specific crime, no named suspect, no direct observation, and no active threat. The wedding guests had heard it. Ethan had heard it. Lillian had heard it with tears still bright in her eyes. Reverend Brooks stood behind the altar, silent but steady, holding the ring pillow as if the small velvet square carried every vow the interruption had tried to silence. Chief Ross turned toward Harrington. You are removed from primary control of this scene pending review. Step outside and remain available for statement. Harrington looked as if the words had entered him slowly. Chief, I acted on public safety. Ross did not raise his voice. Public safety does not excuse ignoring the absence of facts. Ava watched Harrington glance around the chapel, searching for the obedience that had followed him in. He found guests looking back at him now, not with defiance, but with memory. That was worse for him. Defiance could be blamed. Memory had to be answered. Officer Miller stepped to the side to make room as Harrington walked back toward the door, his posture rigid, his face emptied of the certainty he had carried inside. No one applauded. No one jeered. Ava was grateful for that. She did not want triumph to replace dignity. Chief Ross faced the guests and removed his cap. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear enough to reach the back pew. "This ceremony was interrupted based on an unverified complaint that did not provide a specific criminal allegation. That interruption should not have happened in the manner you experienced it. On behalf of the department, I apologize to the bride, the groom, their families, Reverend Brooks, the venue staff, and every guest present." The apology moved through the chapel slowly. It did not erase the fear. It did not lift the weight from Lillian's shoulders all at once. But it named the wrong in public, where the wrong had been done. Ava looked at Chief Ross. "Preserve every record," she said. "Body camera footage, dispatch audio, complaint record, officer notes, venue camera footage, radio traffic, and the time each decision was made." Ross nodded. "Already ordered," Miller added softly. "I documented the lack of specifics before the chief arrived." Ava turned to her. "Then make sure it stays in the report." Miller's eyes lowered with shame, then lifted with resolve. "Yes, Judge Monroe." Ava held her gaze for a moment. "Today, bride is enough." Miller swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." Ethan was allowed to return from the side of the altar. He walked toward Ava slowly, not rushing the moment, not making the officers the center of their reunion. When he reached her, he did not ask whether she was all right in front of everyone. He simply placed his hand over hers around the bouquet, and she let the warmth of him steady the part of her that had stayed strong for too long. "You protected the room," he whispered. Ava looked at the aisle, at the petal near her shoe, at her mother pressing the handkerchief to her lips, at guests who had come dressed for joy and been forced to witness suspicion enter like law. "The room protected the record," she said. Outside, through the open doors, Harrington stood near a patrol car while another officer collected preliminary statements. Inside, Chief Ross stepped back, giving the chapel to the people it belonged to. Reverend Brooks lifted the ring pillow again. The violinist raised her bow, but waited. Ava took one breath. She did not need the raid forgotten. She needed it preserved, named, and unable to disguise itself later as reasonable caution. Then she looked at Ethan and nodded. The ceremony could continue, not because nothing had happened, but because the truth had finally been made to stand where the accusation had stood first. The violin returned first, not loudly, not with the bright confidence it had carried before the interruption, but with a single careful note that rose through the chapel like breath finding its way back into a wounded room. Reverend Samuel Brooks waited until the sound settled, then looked at Ava Monroe and Ethan Cole with eyes wet enough to shine in the stained glass light. "We continue," he said softly, "because love is not made less sacred by what tried to disturb it." The guests sat down slowly, pew by pew, fabric whispering against polished wood, programs being lifted from laps, hands finding other hands. Lillian Monroe wiped her face with the lace handkerchief and straightened in the front row, not fully healed, but present, watching her daughter stand tall in the aisle with white roses and the kind of grace that did not erase pain to prove strength. Chief Ross remained near the back of the chapel, not inside the ceremony, not claiming space, only making sure his officers no longer did. Officer Miller stood beside him with her notebook closed against her chest, her face quiet with the knowledge that accurate records were sometimes the first form of apology. Outside, through the open doors, Harrington stood beside a patrol car under the Georgia sun, no longer directing the room he had entered as if it belonged to his suspicion. Ava looked once toward the doorway, not at him, but at the space where fear had come in. Then she turned back to Ethan. He stepped into the aisle and offered his hand. She took it. His palm was warm, steady, familiar. "I am here," he whispered, not for the guests, not for the cameras, but for the part of her that had held the entire room together while her own wedding paused around her. Ava's fingers tightened once around his. "So am I," she said. Together, they walked the remaining distance to the altar, not as if nothing had happened, but as if what happened would not be allowed to decide the meaning of the day. Reverend Brooks lifted the ring pillow. The gold bands rested in a square of colored light, still waiting, untouched by the accusation that had tried to make the chapel smaller. Ava placed her bouquet beside the Bible, and one loose white rose leaned against the page like a quiet witness. Chief Ross's voice could be heard faintly near the doors, instructing that body camera footage, dispatch audio, complaint records, venue cameras, radio traffic, officer notes, and incident times remain preserved. Ava heard enough to know the record would not disappear. That was all she needed from the interruption now. The rest of her belonged to the vows. Ethan looked at her with the same restraint he had shown when officers moved him aside, but now the restraint had softened into love. Reverend Brooks began again, slower this time, giving each word room to return. "Marriage is a covenant made in public, but held in private courage." Ava breathed in. The chapel smelled again of roses, wood, and candle wax instead of panic. The flower girl leaned against her grandmother, and finally blinked away her fear. The violinist found the melody's second line. Lillian pressed the handkerchief to her heart, and nodded once, as if giving her daughter permission to feel joy again. Ava looked at Ethan, then at the ring in Reverend Brooks's hand. She had spent her life protecting law from becoming only power. Today, in a wedding gown instead of a robe, she had protected joy from becoming only evidence. When Ethan slid the ring onto her finger, the stained glass light caught the gold and sent a small warm flash across her hand. No one spoke over it. No sirens filled it. No accusation interrupted it. For the first time since the doors had opened wrong, the chapel was quiet for the right reason. Ava closed her hand gently around Ethan's, and the silence around them no longer felt like fear. It felt like the room remembering what it had gathered to bless. The vows continued in a chapel that had learned how fragile peace could be and how fiercely it could return. Reverend Samuel Brooks guided Ava Monroe and Ethan Cole through the final words with a voice that no longer trembled, while the stained glass windows poured late Georgia sunlight over the aisle runner, the white roses, the velvet ring pillow, and the single fallen petal near Ava's gown. Outside, the patrol cars began to leave the venue driveway without sirens, one by one, their tires rolling softly over gravel instead of cutting through the ceremony with noise. Chief Ross remained near the chapel doors long enough to make sure the preservation order had been repeated clearly: body camera footage, dispatch audio, complaint record, venue camera footage, radio traffic, officer notes, decision times, and the anonymous caller details would all be secured. Officer Harrington stood outside near the last patrol car, no longer framed by command, no longer speaking into the room, only waiting to give a statement about the decision he had made before the facts had earned it. Officer Miller stayed near the back pew, notebook closed but held carefully, as if the truth inside it had become something she was responsible for protecting. Ava did not look back at the doorway again. She looked at Ethan. His hands held hers with the tenderness of a man who had watched her stand in pain without letting pain become cruelty. The gold band on her finger caught a stripe of blue light from the glass and warmed against her skin. Lillian Monroe sat in the front row with her handkerchief folded neatly in her lap now, tears still on her face, but her shoulders lifted with the quiet strength of a mother seeing her daughter's joy survive what tried to shame it. Reverend Brooks smiled gently. "By the power vested in me," he said, and the room leaned toward the words as if everyone needed them to finish what fear had interrupted. When he pronounced them married, the applause came softly at first, almost careful, then fuller, not wild, not triumphant, but grateful. Ava smiled then, small and real, and Ethan kissed her with reverence, brief and tender, the kind of kiss that belonged to a promise rather than a performance. The violin rose again, fuller now, and guests stood as the newly married couple turned toward the aisle. Ava picked up her bouquet from beside the Bible. One white rose had bent slightly, but none had broken. She and Ethan walked back down the aisle together, past faces that carried love, shame, relief, and memory. Chief Ross stepped aside at the doors, giving them the exit that should have belonged to them from the beginning. "Judge Monroe," he said quietly, then corrected himself with respect. "Mrs. Cole, the record will reflect the timeline accurately." Ava paused just long enough to answer. "Make sure it reflects that my title was not what made the interruption wrong." Ross nodded. "It will." Outside, the evening air was warm and smelled of magnolia, cut grass, and rain waiting somewhere beyond the trees. The patrol lights were gone. The stone walkway was clear. The guests followed slowly behind, leaving the chapel in a hush that felt almost sacred again. Ava stood with Ethan beneath the wooden arch, her bouquet resting between them, her wedding ring bright in the fading light. She heard her mother laugh through tears behind her. She heard Reverend Brooks close the Bible. She heard the violin soften into a final note. For one quiet moment, no badge, no radio, no false complaint, and no stranger's fear had the power to define the day. Ava looked down at the fallen rose petal that had clung to the hem of her gown, lifted it gently, and placed it inside her bouquet. Then she took Ethan's hand and stepped into the garden, not as a woman rescued by her title, but as a bride whose dignity had refused to leave the aisle before love could finish speaking.